Now there is another way to try and be rational about comparing different risks, and that is to look at how much money you're prepared to spend to save a human life. So if, for example, we think that nuclear reactors are dangerous and we want to close them all down, that's going to cost a lot of money to put a replacement. How many lives are saved per $1 million, for example? And this is an interesting way to think about the trade-offs involved in saving lives. Now, this is a very difficult thing to talk about because a lot of people, including me, find this very uncomfortable. How can you put a value on someone's life? If a politician says, no, we're not going to save your life, it's too expensive, that politician is out of office, I think. The media is constantly full of stories about so-and-so is dying because the government won't pay for their $400,000 a day drug treatment or something like this. But it's worth persevering with this because it is actually possible to put a value on someone's life, because we do this actually all the time, just without thinking of it in those terms. For example, let's say you are going to buy a new car. You could buy an expensive fancy car with all the latest safety features, or an old banger that is falling to pieces. Generally speaking, you're going to have to pay more if you want a car that's safer. And you can look at how much people will pay for safety, as opposed to other things. People might prefer a faster car or a bigger car, but there are cars that vary in safety, and how much more are you prepared to pay for a safe car? And you can look at what the odds are of you dying if you're in an unsafe car, and therefore put a value, how much you have paid to reduce the risk of dying by a certain percentage. You can also look at how much government pays for things. For example, let's say the government is going to put in streetlights at an intersection on a freeway. That will reduce the number of deaths, or at least the risk of death at that intersection, but it will cost money both to put in and to run. And so again, you can put a value on that. Or let's say the government is deciding whether to pay for more police to reduce the murder rate. Again, it's going to cost money and save a certain number of lives. Or a medical procedure, they're going to build a new hospital or hire more doctors to reduce waiting room waits. All these things cost money and save lives. And so you can, for each of these things, look at how much it costs to save a life. And people have done this, and governments often use this as a way to decide what's the best thing to spend money on. And typically in rich countries like Australia or the USA, it's between $1 and $10 million per person to save a life. Now, so we can't normally talk about this in public. You'll find websites with the Australian government cost per life, but it's not something politicians go on the TV and talk about. It's also different depending whether it's a 100% chance of dying or a small chance. So let's imagine someone comes and puts a gun to your head and says, unless you pay me $10 million, I will shoot you. That's a different story from buying a safer car to reduce a 1 in 1,000 chance of dying. But generally speaking, you work out for different interventions, number of lives saved divided by the cost. Or see how much people actually spend on things that make them safer. Or maybe you look at, let's say someone dies, how much money they would have earned per year and for the rest of their life, and treat that as the cost of a life. Now that approach, dollars per life saved, so-called the statistical life, is what's used for things like road accidents commonly. For medicine, what's often used instead is the quality adjusted life year. So this is the amount of money it costs to make a person live 1 year longer in perfect health. So the idea of this is that it's better to save a young person's life than an old person's life. So if you save the life of a 20-year-old, they might go on and live for another 60 years. Whereas if you save the life of a 95-year-old, they might only live another year before dying. And also the idea is it's better to have an intervention that leaves people in good health rather than something that, like an intensive care system, they're still alive but they're racked by chronic pain and on a ventilating machine. And the idea is a pill that means people don't get ill at all is better than something that keeps them in pain but keeps them alive. And this is widely used in medical circles to try and work out, is it worth investing in this treatment or this drug or this medical procedure, whatever it might be. And typically in rich countries, it's between $100,000 and $200,000 per QAL, they call it, quality adjusted life year. And once again, this is politically very difficult. Just imagine the story. Every time you say, we're not going to spend on this particular drug because it costs too much for every life year saved, it's a death committee in the government deciding you will live and you will die. So what does well on this? Well, the best are things that both save money and save lives. For example, if you passed a law making smoking illegal, that would save money because you don't have to pay for all the health care, and it will save lives. Let's say you reduce the speed limits for cars to 30 kilometers an hour everywhere. That will probably eliminate almost all road deaths. Or like a tax on fast food for children. If you make at McDonald's, if they sell a hamburger to someone under the age of 80, they have to pay $1,000. That will save lives, and the tax will raise lots of money. But these are all a bit unpopular because they stop people from doing things they like doing, like driving faster or smoking. Then there are other things like, for example, we've seen that renewable energy is actually cheaper now than fossil fuels. So replacing coal-powered power plants with renewable or possibly even nuclear, that will save lives. I mean, nuclear and renewables are much safer per terawatt hour generated, as we've seen, though there's of course the risk of catastrophic disasters from nuclear power. So why doesn't everyone just do this? It's going to save money. Well, again, there are all the political reasons, plus you need a lot of upfront capital. It's also actually very hard to calculate the costs and benefits, and people fight about these enormously. What is most cost effective? Well, most people's calculations say that malaria prevention in Africa, use of drugs or nets to stop children dying from malaria, costs about $4,000 per child's life saved, which is extremely good value. Another very good value intervention, according to the research, is if you pay poor people, again in Africa, say $150 if they get their children vaccinated. This means that many more children are vaccinated if people are getting paid to do it, and that saves a lot of lives. And again, the estimate is that costs about $4,000 worth of these subsidies to get a child vaccinated. Usually health prevention, for example, taxes on junk food or advertising campaigns to persuade people to exercise, are much more cost effective than intensive care surgery at the end. And some medical interventions like vaccines and like high blood pressure pills are extremely cost effective, whereas intensive care in hospital is very bad. Now there are a couple of very interesting philosophical arguments about this. One is how you factor in the cost per life of people in rich countries versus poor countries. Now, an ethical argument would say that a life is a life, and it's every bit as worthwhile saving the life of a poor subsistence farmer in Africa as a rich merchant banker in New York City, which I would tend to agree with, but that's not how the calculation normally works, because the calculation is based on, if you ask people, they would almost always say, yes, every life is valuable. But if you look at how money is actually spent, then you'll find that people are actually willing to spend far more money to save the lives of rich people. You could save the lives of 500 children in Africa for the same price as hospital treatment for one elderly US citizen. And partially this is because a lot of the spending is our own. I'm probably prepared to spend a lot more money on saving my life than somebody else's. This is very important for the calculations for global warming. Global warming tends to kill people in poor countries, but damage property in rich countries, which is more important. If you do a dollar figure calculation, it can be that saving all those houses in Florida is more important than 1 million people in Bangladesh, which many people would find morally abhorrent, but that's what the numbers tend to say, which may be telling us these numbers aren't really what we want. Perhaps the trickiest philosophical issue is that of present lives versus future lives. We've talked about saving people's lives, but surely that would also apply to having more people in the future. Is a life today worth more or less than a life of someone 1,000 years from now? So here's human population over history. So for most of the world's history there were very few people, and it's grown very rapidly in the last a couple of 100 years. So we're now up to, 7 or 8 billion people on the world. We've got to think what's going to happen in the future. Some future graphs mean that the vast majority of people will live 1 billion years from now, whereas others have most people living today. So here's a few possible scenarios for how many people might be around at different stages in the future. So the most pessimistic is the black line, which is that humans become extinct fairly soon. Population maybe keeps rising for a bit, and then, I don't know, artificial intelligence takes over, someone genetically engineers a pandemic that kills us all, there's a nuclear war, or everyone just stops having children because they're too busy playing on their phones. In that case, this integral under here is the number of people in the future, which is not that great. The next scenario is that the population of the Earth sinks and then stabilizes at some low value. This would be a low-tech, environmentally friendly, probably what the green parties around the world would like, where we keep within the carrying capacity of the Earth without having to use incredible high technology to support it. And this has a lot more people than the extinction. Again, you're integrating under this curve, all this area over here, you get more people. But then let's have another population idea, which is earthbound high-tech. Let's imagine the population of the Earth continues to rise to maybe 10 billion or so, and then stays there. Now, in this case, the integral under the curve is much greater. There are going to be much larger numbers of future people around. So this model might have 1,000,000 times more future people than the extinction model, and maybe 100 times more than the low-tech model. Is that worth something? That's a lot of people under this model who are going to live and die, hopefully good lives, that wouldn't have lived and died under the other things. Isn't that comparable to killing people off today? This is kind of the argument some people use for spaceflight. For example, if you colonize the solar system, you might be able to have a population that peaks out at 100 billion rather than 5 or 10 billion. So again, that's going to lead to a vastly greater number of people living ever. And colonizing the galaxy, if we spread by interstellar travel across the galaxy, then the number of people under this scenario dwarfs everything else. So some people would say that the most cost-effective thing we can do to have the greatest number of lives is don't worry about saving a few people's lives today. Anything we can do to adjust which of these curves we go on to in the future is going to make far more difference to the total number of people who ever existed. Make sense to you? It's an interesting argument.